And thank you so much for taking time out from Climate Week New York to talk to me. I know it must be the busiest week in your calendar. Um, I really like the Getting It Done theme this year. Can you tell me why you chose that?
Yeah, we actually we were having a conversation at the beginning of the year, and we sort of always at the beginning of the calendar year start to think, what is it that we need to do this year? And we're having a conversation. We were quite inspired by Greta Thunberg, who was saying at that point, stop telling me about 2050 and tell me about now. And I thought it's such a good point, but we also, because we work with businesses, we know it's not quite that simple. But it's real that there's so much focus on 2030, 2050, and those are really important milestones. And I think it's really critical that businesses, set out where they're going to be, understand what your business needs to look like in those years. But there can be a bit too much sort of set that long-term goal and then a little bit quiet then on how you're going to get there. And actually, if we're going to halve emissions this decade, we have to start right now. What you do, tomorrow, next year, that really, really matters. And so we wanted to sort of capture that sense of urgency and action and let's get practical now about the transition. And that's where the theme came from.
And I think the Getting Real report seems to really hit that very squarely, doesn't it? And it also just sums up some of the dilemma that companies are facing with this. So this is a really, really heavy lift they're being asked. In the next 9 years, they have to cut their emissions. I mean, globally, it's a huge lift, of course, and companies have to play a really, really very, very important role in this. So they have to hit their 2030 emissions reductions goals with the tools they have today, and without waiting for policymakers. You can't really expect a supporting environment. I mean, as your conversation with John Kerry today, and he's saying, it's about political will. And the noises we're hearing about COP26, how much, is there going to be enough political will on display? So companies can't just wait for that. They have to be doing this on their own in a lot of ways, and as well as sustaining a growing and profitable business. So, you have to deliver on your commercial goals and transition goals at the same time. So how is this possible?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think that when you look at the companies that are leading in this area, so Unilever is always the one that's cited, Inca Group, IKEA, they've been thinking this for a long time, and that leadership really from the top and saying this is a whole business transition. I'm sure that most people, your audience, will have heard Paul Polman talking about this for years now. And I think other businesses maybe have been slower to catch on, and there was a long period where I'm sure as you were talking to businesses, I was like, well, until the government regulates, we're not going to do anything. And I do feel that has shifted a bit, and there's a more, not entirely, but there's a more sophisticated, I think, understanding of that kind of interaction between markets and policymakers. If we look at our EV 100 initiative, which is around corporate ownership of electric vehicles, and we focused on them because if a market like the UK, more than 60% of new vehicles in a year are bought by corporate fleets. So you can use them to start transitioning, and that creates this big demand signal, which is a demand signal to the supply side. But when we go out to our members and say, okay, what's stopping you do this tomorrow? Most of you got, I think, 2030 goals, or they've all got 2030 goals. Why can't you do it in 2022? They say, well, actually, there just aren't enough vehicles. So the supply side needs to go up. Well, one of the reasons the supply side isn't there is because they haven't had a clear enough signal from policymakers that they really need to get on this quickly. There are end dates, and I think we all celebrated when these sort of 2040, 2035 end dates came in. But we started working with our members saying that really we need a 2030 end date for the combustion engine in order to drive the market fast enough. And so we brought together a group of UK businesses. It was called the UK Electric Fleet Coalition, because COP is coming to the UK in a few weeks' time, and so it's expected that the host plays a leadership role. And those businesses saying to government, if you bring that date forward, we're not going to oppose it, we will support you. And I think what a lot of governments need to hear is that supportive voice from businesses saying that they're not going to be lobbied against when they do things. And I think that relationship, the kind of the fear that we'll bring something tougher in and then we'll get lobbied and then we'll push it back, and how do you persuade how do you take bold action? And it's getting different players within the system to work. So the UK has moved that end date forward to 2030, and now we can go and talk to other governments and say, look, they've got this. So it's about that systems thinking. And I think that idea of systems thinking is getting better, and that relationship with policymakers is getting better understood.
But, okay, so looking at EV 100, some of the other EP 100 you've got, and your Still Zero initiative, which is also really interesting. We've been writing about that in the latest issue of Ethical Corporation magazine. Those, I mean, Still Zero in particular, those technologies look very promising, but very nascent. And how, I think you've only got 10 members of the Still Zero initiative.
Yeah, it's very new. So, and the other campaign started in the same way, where we recruit a few members to get it going, and then we build it. And look, Still Zero, it's completely different in that sense from something like EV 100. So EV 100 and RE 100 are really about taking technologies that exist to scale. How do you get huge, rapid scaling up in renewable energy? Or in electric vehicles? Still Zero is about, as you said, it's a nascent technology. So that is about setting out a marker now that there is a demand, and that companies are willing to spend money on this. And so taking a very different message into the supply side than right now. But we still think, as we were doing, we do a lot of pre-research as we set these things up. There was and we have a partnership there with Responsible Steel, and it looked like a really good and necessary part of trying to now trigger changes in the hard to abate sector. And I think one of the other things that's changed in the last few years is that those sectors, we call them hard to abate because they don't have the technologies. But I think there's been a real shift towards, this is going to be necessary and it's possible, and how do we get that going? And so rather than an initiative that comes up at the point where you're trying to scale up, it's earlier in the kind of innovation curve, but it's again that same principle of, like, if we can get that demand signal going, how does that help stimulate the market and help acceleration? So yeah, it's our newest initiative, and hoping we're working on growing it in the coming years.
How successful? I mean, I see that is Volkswagen and BMW, are they part of that Still Zero initiative? I know that they've signed up for.
I don't have
sorry.
400 members in different companies,
of course,
and different campaigns. Sorry.
Yes, sorry, I'll do my own homework on that. But
I mean, we are, automotive is a clear, on the supply side, who we want to engage with. Automotive is really critical.
And I guess they're critical. Well, obviously with along a whole range in EV and EP, presumably as well. I mean, the whole idea of energy productivity and energy and efficiency, it does seem incredible to me that energy efficiency is only increasing at about 2% a year, when that seems to be really low-hanging fruit, and that there should be.
Energy efficiency is such a hard bit of the energy transition. And I think I've had different theories about this over the years. I mean, for a lot of companies, the solution that you need it's very sort of bespoke from kind of company to company what you're going to need, because it depends on your processes. I also think one of my theories on this is that there's a bit of an assumption, I think, at the kind of CEO level or there, that if there was money to be saved, we would have saved it. Like that, there can't be. We wouldn't. Of course, we couldn't have left dollar bills on the floor. That's crazy. But actually, when companies do it, they do find these huge savings, and you'll get companies talking about Johnson Controls and Hilton Hotels and members of EP 100 who kind of go out and talk about this. Like, we've saved millions through energy efficiency measures. But there can be a sense of like, well, that can't be the case for our company because we would have worked it out. And I think that can be a kind of barrier to action there.
Though another interesting session today talking about the use of technologies and digital twins and all kinds of different innovation to try and just make our processes so much more streamlined, to manage buildings better, to manage processes better. So I guess there's quite a bit of headroom that can be achieved just through that. Yeah,
and I think, and I don't know specifically, they talked about that at that event, but one of the things we run into is a kind of landlord tenant problem. So when you have a building, it can be the tenant that's paying the energy bills, but the landlord would have to put in the energy efficiency measures. So it's one thing when you've got new build and you can spec these things from the outset and you can sell, smart building, that's very exciting and it becomes part of the offer. But how do you, retrofit? That can be a big cost to landlords, and it's not them that will save money. So I think there's a lot there in the kind of just the shape of markets that can be a barrier to some of those things rolling out at the speed which, from the outside, you're like, of course that would make sense to do, but it's that kind of deep contractual headaches that you get into.
I guess that's where it comes to systems level transformation rather than kind of the individual buildings, but I don't know.
Yeah, and that is where regulation has a role to play. And I think that when if you can get really good building standards, and again, I think that building standards are improving for new builds, but again, I think retrofit, we all know, is going to be the really big problem for economies which are like the UK or the US, where so much of the building stock exists already.
So another message in the report is innovate the business, not just the technology, which is interesting. How can you tease that out a bit more, what that means?
Yeah, and I think so. It's about how you create, there can be this real kind of techno-fix approach, but actually understanding how you create conditions for experimentation and innovation within your businesses rather than just placing bets on technology. That was a key sort of discussion point there. And it's about creating new value and understanding and innovating ways that you can kind of create that value, share value, getting into adjacent business areas we talk about, and growing these kind of deeper collaborative customer relationships. So it's not just like stick a green premium on things, but or getting the latest technology or approaching it that way, but really kind of rethinking your business model. So if you look at a company, I mentioned Inca Group, IKEA earlier, they've since 2017 been designing products with repurposing, repairing, reusing, resold, recycled. They want to have 100% of their range fully circular by 2030. And so everything within that range is going to need a slightly different approach, but setting that overall kind of transformative business goal and then understanding how you then get into that detail underneath it.
And also the whole net zero target setting. I mean, some people will say that there's a lot of greenwash. They can't see how can you set a target to 1.5, to be net zero by 2050, especially when a CEO may be in post for 2 or 3 years, and it's so far beyond the horizon. But I was also interested in the report talking to Nestle, for example. Now, Nestle has just the World Business World Benchmarking Alliance has just released its food benchmarking of the food system, companies in the food system. Nestle was number 2, but beneath Unilever. But they made a commitment in 2019 to conform with 1.5 C, but didn't, and thought, how the heck are we going to do this? We don't know. We've got 95% of our value chain is scope 3 emissions, but they've kind of worked through it. But it's a big risk, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think people can be cynical about 2050 because the other thing you think is, well, I set this goal for 2050, I'll be gone by then, so that's fine. But I think what we've seen with the companies who are leading in this area is they set those very long-term goals, and you set it at the CEO level, and then it does push back into the company because you can't be sitting there thinking, well, that's not my bit, or it's, because some of these are very long-term. It's got to come with, that's why we talk about getting it done or getting real, because you can't just set the goal and hope and say, well, I've put the goal out there, this business will transform, by osmosis. You've got to then get quite active about what you're doing now. And so I think that if you look at, Unilever, who are doing work on their supply chain, aiming to spend 2 billion euros annually by 2025 with suppliers that are majority owned, managed, controlled by women, racial, ethnic minorities, or LGBTQI plus people, or people with disabilities. So they've got this real diversity goal within their supply chain, quite near term, 2025. So they're going to have to do a lot of work to do that, but it's actually unlocking the innovation and agility within the business to do it. So it's a different way of thinking. So it's about, to get back to kind of more to the question, but it's like setting that 2050 goal is critical, because without setting those targets, I think nothing will happen, or very much at the margins. But if you set the goal, you've then got to bring in these plans of actions and say, right, this is what how we're going to break that goal down, what's happening by 2025, what's happening by 2030, and so on. So yeah, it's sort of taking that urgency, and I think one of the other key messages in the report is build experience, don't wait for it to get easier. So just sort of sitting and hoping isn't going to do it. And that's why I think if there aren't detailed plans, that's where you start to get into the kind of, this is just greenwash, we've just set the target. So that's what the report and our work is about. It's like saying, right, you've set that goal, now tell us how you're going to deliver on it.
How important do you think a science-based target standard is going to be? Because that's apparently what's going to be launched, is an actual global standard for a net zero business by 2050.
Yeah, I think look, standards have a clear role, because otherwise, what I worry about is that we spend so much time arguing about, what net zero is, what do we mean by it, that actually diverts resources from doing the actual work. And I do worry when people are never willing to, never willing to leave the debate alone. And there's kind of like, well, that's not going to, it's like, we need to do the work. This is urgent. We need to start moving. So in that sense, if a standard can help sort that out and get us beyond spending so much energy sort of arguing it through all the time, I'm definitely think that's a good thing. And you see it with, no one questions there being accounting standards, for instance, because it's a framework of everyone counting things in the same way. And I think that's really critical to taking that approach.
But also, isn't there, some rigor over the use of offsets is probably going to be needed in order to, a lot of the greenwash concerns are about companies saying they're just going to offset their way into net zero.
Yeah, I think we've got to, that's going to be one of the big critical areas in the next coming decades, because you're right, we can't offset our way out of this, because there won't be enough offsets when everyone gets to it. So I think sorting that out is really important.
What do you want to come out of COP, besides obviously an ambitious global agreement? From the business perspective, what is really important to emerge from COP?
With COP and these other processes, the critical bit is just is reaffirming the direction of travel, and seeing that higher level of ambition. And yeah, I suppose I haven't thought of COP in particular in terms of like what do we want from it for businesses. It's more, we sort of go with it, here's what business is bringing, and here's what the businesses we're working with are bringing to it, which is that sense of, come on governments, if you are bold, we will be with you. Look at what we're doing. I think business has been one of those dynamic bits of the, in delivering carbon reduction. We've seen a lot of movement from leading businesses. Other businesses worked out that maybe the kind of the fast followers think, hang on, this does make sense if we look to the long term. And with the example I gave on EVs earlier, when you bring that energy together and you can go to governments and say, look, you can be bold. And so we're coming at COP very much from that perspective of like, we are turning up and saying, here's what's happening, come on, national leaders. So that's, and we're heavily involved on the, as I mentioned, with the UK Electric Fleets Coalition, we're very involved in the transport side and bringing that, but we'll also be bringing policy asks from the RE100 campaign around renewable energy. And I think increasingly taking that voice of business with the policy asks to the policymakers is going to be an important part of the work.
How important do you think whole just transition agenda is? And do you think companies have really internalized it? I mean, there's civil society is saying that has to be, have companies actually accepted that message? And has COVID had anything to do with the change in attitude?
I don't know if it's COVID has changed the attitude or just watching pictures of climate disasters and seeing who it's affecting. I mean, you can't really look at something like the recent hurricanes. I'm in New York this week, you know, and Hurricane Ida hit, and you saw all those pictures and who's affected. It just brings it home to people. And I think, definitely businesses haven't internalized it yet, but again, I sort of think the kind of rhetoric moves and then the action sort of follows. So that it's good that that conversation is starting. I do worry that this is the kind of the lack of diversity in boardrooms is going to slow this down, because I think that, you know, the more diverse views you have at the top leadership, the more open you probably are to understanding the problem and embracing it. So I know that sort of seems like something, I think sometimes people talk about diversity in boardrooms, but sort of it's a bit like, oh yeah, we should be more diverse because that's a good thing to be, but not understanding it's a good thing to be because it helps you understand the world in which your business operates better. And I think that that may slow down progress, but it'd be interesting to see how that plays out.
And presumably diversity, not just in terms of more gender diversity.
No, I mean proper diversity.
Yeah.
Diversity. Yeah. That's the other thing you see in some boardrooms. They're like, oh, we've got some women, it's fine. It's just, no, that's not it. I mean, that's step one. Well done. But let's move on to steps 3, 4, 5 very quickly if we can. So I think that proper sense of a diverse contribution to how your business is thinking about itself will really help on that just transition. Now, we can see how slow that shift is happening, and I think that really needs to, it's not the only thing that needs to happen for businesses to grasp that, but I expect we'll start to see businesses who are more diverse getting there a bit faster and internalizing what climate justice means.
There had been, you mentioned Greta Thunberg at the start. She had said we shouldn't have COP this year. It should be another delay. There have been other NGOs that have said there should be a delay. There's not going to be enough representation from the global South there. What's your view on?
Yeah, I don't think it should be delayed. I think if you weigh up the bad things, I think not bringing the heavy emitters to COP and getting them committed to proper emissions reductions and getting that conversation about finance happening, I think that's worse than you know, the people not being able to turn up. I think there's been, since that was said, I think there's been some more efforts by the UK government to look at how do we get more people there. And I think it's really true that the breakthroughs in COP have happened because people are together, and it's much harder to look at someone whose country is going underwater to their face and say, well, we're not going to help you, than it is over, say, kind of the remoteness of a Zoom call or something. So I'm not saying that participation isn't important. It really, really is. But I don't think a delay to the COP is in countries' best interests either. So I think we get this COP done. Next year's COP will be in Africa. We need to kind of keep this process moving forward. I think a delay wouldn't help that. So no, I don't agree. I completely get the reasons why, and I think it's a tough one because it's so vital to have as many people there as possible. But I don't think a delay would be productive.
Helen, I'm very grateful for your time this evening, and I appreciate how busy you are, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to seeing you in Glasgow.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
See you then.
Bye-bye.